So hello everyone, thank you for joining the lecture, both the Depreciation students and those who are not part of the class. I'm very happy to introduce today Professor Caitlin Rosenthal, who's an associate professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley. So just a quick introductory note. Those of you who read the material notice that this lecture is not about accounting, as you may have guessed from a corporate law class. It's about slavery, which is a hugely important issue for our class, which means that many of the topics that we're going to discuss, both in the lecture and the Q&A, may be sensitive or may produce all sorts of different reactions. So if you prefer to not be present in this lecture, that is totally fine. You can choose to either not be present or to watch it recorded later on. And if in the middle of it, you also decide that you prefer not to be present for different reasons, you are totally free to choose to Zoom out. The one benefit of Zoom is that you don't have the awkwardness of walking out of our room, so no one would even notice. But I'm very glad that Professor Rosenthal is here to talk to us about this hugely important issue for the different topics that we're discussing as part of Professor Blackett's Slavery and the Law lecture series with the Labor Law and Development Lab. So I think, Professor Blackett, can you give us a bit of context as to the lecture series that this is part of?
With pleasure. So bienvenue, welcome, Professor Rosenthal. Thank you very much, Professor Kufun, for hosting this series on slavery and the law. And just a little background, it emerged out of the first real requests from students to have engagement, serious engagement with slavery and the law, its role as a global institution, including the shaping of law and legal institutions, as well as legal principles over time. And so I taught it as a course in 2016 for 1 year, and that was a wonderful experience for everyone involved. And that was an intensive experience, but it was an experience that reached a necessarily small group. Part of moving towards a lecture series has been to broaden and integrate teaching on slavery and the law in courses that are taken by the broad student body. So first year, second year obligatory courses, and courses like Professor Kofon's that have very wide enrollment, and where people might not initially think that there really is a link. And here we have in a book like Professor Rosenthal's serious engagement with how some core understandings, in particular around scientific management, have emerged out of slavery. So I'm looking forward to this lecture, and I'm happy to turn it over to Professor Kofon again with renewed thanks so that he can welcome our speaker.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and well, yeah, I have nothing else to add other than thank you so much, Professor Rothsar, for coming today, and the floor is yours.
Wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully.
Oh, did I make you co-host?
Oh, you have to.
Yes, let me make you co-host in 1 second.
Make sure to make me co-host. I recently had a talk where I gave away my hosting procedures and that I couldn't get them back.
Oh no, there you go. Yeah.
All right. Excellent. Okay. All right, can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Wonderful. I have been trying to figure out a way so that I can point to things on the images while I give the talk. So as you know, I'm here to talk about the history of accounting as it happened on slave plantations, and really with the broader question of what we can learn from the business history of slavery. Why is it worth thinking about this history? Why is it worth going back through these documents? And what can we pull out of them as we think about developing more ethical, legal, and business practices today? And so I'm going to do a couple of things. One is to give you a kind of bird's eye view of the range of records that plantations used. So kind of the full view of different types of accounts that were kept on plantations. And the second is to zoom in on one set of accounts, which is how these records valued people. And along the way, I'm going to try to connect this to some questions that I think are relevant, particularly relevant if you're thinking about the law or about business and about business history more generally. But my expertise is as a historian, so hopefully you'll help me to make those connections, and I'm really excited to answer your questions at the end. So as I mentioned, I'll give an overview, and then I'll talk about valuing lives and the ways that planters did this in 3 different ways: through calculating appreciation and depreciation, through grading people into distinct categories, through a system I call fractional hands. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about how people triangulated between these 2 different methods of valuing people. Because sometimes when you talk about the history of economic development and the history of capitalism, people have tended to talk about the fact that labor, it being capital, is sort of a barrier to thinking in a profit-oriented way. And as you'll see in these records, planters are always moving back and forth between the 2. It's not a barrier. In fact, it's probably an advantage for them to think about people in this very flexible way. Let me adjust the screen so I get it just right. All right. So since you're not an audience of historians, I did want to give you a tiny bit of a sense of the stakes for what it means to write slavery back into business history. Because on the one hand, slave plantations left behind a huge trove of records, both in the Caribbean and across multiple empires, and then also in the American South. And yet, despite this huge amount of business records, almost no one who is interested in the history of business has used these records. There are very early examples. There's an article in 1973 where Keith Aufhauser, an economic historian, argued that slavery was an early site for scientific management. But then it kind of drops out of the literature. And Alfred Chandler, who is probably the most famous business historian of all time and remains the most influential voice in the field, even 20 years after his most important works, called it a fundamentally ancient form of production. And basically, when he was thinking about what kinds of businesses are modern and developing, he lopped slavery out of this group. And this is despite recognizing that these are complex organizational structures, despite recognizing that they kept detailed records, yet he separated them off. And really, my book and a lot of other work by historians right now is about trying to stop separating slavery out. And to think about, what if we integrate slavery back in and we do a more holistic history of business? What new things can we learn about the history of American business and the history of capitalism more broadly? And then if you think beyond the US context, about the emergence of capitalism in the Atlantic world, the Caribbean, and Europe as well. And a management scholar named Bill Cook argued in 2003 that basically the neglect for so long of this legacy amounted to denial. And what I think is important to dwell for a minute on the word denial, because if you look here at this kind of very, very brief overview of which could go on and on, we see people realizing very early from readily available records that there's a story to be told here. And yet the story doesn't get told for at least half a century. Cook comes in and says, look, I'm not a historian, first and foremost, and I just went into secondary literature, so books read by historians. I didn't even go into the archives, and already I could see that there's a story to be told here, and yet we continue not to grapple with the story. So this book, and also the kind of whole range of work right now that's on the history of slavery and capitalism, is, I think, an attempt to push back against this and to understand both what it would take to integrate slavery into the history of business, but then also why for so long we've been so resistant and unable to do it. Why it's been so hard to understand that slavery is such a big, big deal when it comes to the history of American business. So the central argument that I'm going to make is basically a simple one. First, it's that planters use their power over enslaved people as a management advantage. So to put this differently, the relationship here is not incidental. For a long time, people have said, oh, some slaveholders use sophisticated management practices. But the records that you're going to see show planters using their power over people and to keep better records and to implement managerial strategies. So they actually benefit from slavery as they're developing their data practices and their management practices. And then I will try at a few points to compare these practices to management practices in other settings. And from that, you can see that planters are not only using sophisticated data strategies to commodify and to measure and evaluate enslaved people, but they're also using strategies that are in some cases more advanced and more sophisticated than people in settings that we're used to thinking about as at the cutting edge of management. Now, since this is not a group of historians, I do want to just pause for a moment, because you're probably not used to looking at records coming from slave plantations. And throughout the talk, you'll hear me describe the planters' records as things like sophisticated. And when I say planters were sophisticated, I in no way mean to celebrate their techniques, but rather to point out that they're using techniques that we've identified as among the most advanced of the period. I once gave a talk at a business school, and I had someone said, "Oh, you study slavery and capitalism." And they said, "Oh, well, if you're studying slavery and capitalism, you must be saying something good about slavery." And I was like, "What? No, I'm trying to say something critical about capitalism." So what we're interested in doing here is understanding that not only could planters be highly advanced, but they could be advanced in a setting where advancement and innovation went along with violence and brutality, and that we need to grapple with that if we want to think about how to make businesses more ethical. So I do this across a whole range of different topics. The overall scope of my studies, I've divided into 4 areas, just to give you a sense. And I selected these areas because they're things that business historians have pointed to as particularly sophisticated. So the development of organizational structures is one focus. And you can see on the right here, this is a organizational structure of a plantation in Jamaica called Parnassus Plantation. And I used a planter's record books to reconstitute this organizational structure. Everything box with a dashed line around it is an enslaved person. And at the bottom, there are usually many enslaved people in these bottom boxes. And then the boxes without the dashes are free people who are managing the plantation. And what you can see is it's an immensely complex organizational structure. It includes people with a lot of different skills, and people with these skills are both enslaved and free. And at the top, you have a huge amount of power in the hands of the overseers here and the attorney, John Schickel in this case, who are managing the estate. And this is a setting where I focused on business practices, but people are also excavating the history of law on these plantations. And as you notice, the top official on a plantation is called an attorney, and that's because top managerial positions were always dealing with both legal and business issues. And they weren't attorneys in the way we think of today, but they included in their purview of activities kind of a huge range of things in terms of writing contracts and things like that. So the next area that I talk about is standardization. And you're going to see in the pages that follow that a lot of the records that I'm going to share with you are not just handwritten, hand-line records. They are pre-printed blank forms. If I translate it into the language of my kindergartner, they're Mad Libs, where planters just had to fill in the blanks and add up the numbers, and then they would learn to be a better manager. So there are not only a few people doing advanced practices, but they're standardized practices that are dispersed across many plantations. A third area that I talk about, and this one I'm going to pause to tell you a little bit more, is productivity analysis and labor management. And then eventually I'll go on to talk about valuation practices in a great deal of detail. But first, let me tell you a little bit about productivity analysis and labor management, because this is the set of records that drew me into this topic. I had set off to write a history of big business. I was interested in what happened as businesses got big, as they encountered workers as data. And I started out working on free labor settings in cotton textile mills and things like that. And this is the set of documents that made me think that there was a really big story to be told in the history of slavery. So this first one record is Thomas Affleck's accounting system. It shows a number of the things I've already said. First of all, this is an all-in-one journal. It had between 15 and 20 different blank forms in it, depending on the type of your crop. So it's an all-in-one journal that's supposed to have every record you need in order to run a plantation. Now, the reason for this complex journal is that planters often had difficulty recruiting overseers and getting them to keep the records they wanted to. So they could make it a part of an overseer's contract that they have to fill out these documents. And so they're gaining not just control over what's happening on their plantation, but what's happening over the overseer. And in the Caribbean, there's a whole nother genre of records that are like this, that are monthly reports. And those ones are not just reviewed by an owner and kept by an overseer, but they're sent back across the Atlantic because they're mostly reviewed by absentee planters who were never set foot on the plantation. So this is an all-in-one journal and it came in 6 different varieties by crop and size. As you can see at the bottom, it comes for cotton plantations of 3 sizes, number 1 for a plantation of working 40 hands, all the way up to 120. And at the bottom, 2 sizes of sugar plantation books. And he eventually adds a sixth variety. And one thing to think about is in the context of these being really big businesses, 120 hands here is not the total number of enslaved people who are laboring on a plantation. 120 hands is the working hands who can be expected to go to the field regularly. So a plantation of 120 is probably more like a plantation of 200 once you include children and the elderly who are often put to work, but not in the way that the book describes. Now within this book, the most commonly completed record, and planters use these as they chose. So some of the records they filled out and some of them they didn't, but they always fill out the record of cotton picked. Down the left-hand side of the page, you can see the names of each enslaved person, Joe Eustace, Ned, all the way down. And across the top, you can see the days of the week: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Usually you had 6 full days of picking, and sometimes you had work on Sunday, depending on how desperate they are to bring the crop in. And for almost every single day and every single person, you see the total number of pounds of cotton they've picked on this particular day. So Eustace has picked 250 pounds, 255, 295, 310, 280, 275, and they sum it up to 1,665. And sometimes if as people picked 500, 700 pounds of cotton, the best pickers during the peak times of the year. And then you have other people, here Abraham picking 75 pounds, probably weaker or older. So the planter's still learning to get work out of everyone on the plantation. Now, what was most remarkable to me as someone who'd looked at lots of historical records was how successful planters were at filling in all these blanks. I had looked at a lot of records from northern textile mills from about the same time, and they're just full of people who are quitting. Turnover in those mills is 100% per year, sometimes more. And planters try to keep productivity data, but they're rarely, if ever, successful at keeping this kind of relentless data day in, day out on every single person on the plantation. And there's 2 economists who've taken advantage of this to go back and think about whether productivity was increasing over this time period. And using data from books like this, they've collected, first of all, hundreds of thousands of individual data points. And then they've shown that productivity on the plantation between around 1820 and 1860 increases something like 4 times. So by 1860, people are picking 4 times as much cotton as they were able to pick at the beginning of the period. And there are a whole bunch of things that contribute to this. They argue that the most important one is the adoption of new strains of more pickable cotton. But if you read deeper, both in these records and in slave narratives, you can see that it's also about the management practices that planters are using, and it's also about the threat of violence that's always looming over the plantation. Planters are able to measure how much work people can do and accelerate the pace of labor from day to day so that each person will pick as much cotton as they can. Now, here's the final example from that plantation record book, just to give you a sense of the fact that this was not just a set of individual records, but a complex system. This is the planter's annual balance sheet. It's Form O. This one was Form C. And every other form would feed into other forms, and then those would produce information to feed into this form. So you can see that you fill in from page I, page J, page K, different pieces of data. You put them into a balance sheet, and then you'll know whether you've gained or lost. So this compared quite favorably, and there's this kind of in that it's very sophisticated to what you would see in free factories at the time. I would though say, when you look at planters' record books, often they don't fill this out, because they would fill this out and it showed that they earned a big profit, but that profit might be because the value of the enslaved people that they owned had increased. And they only intended to keep planting cotton. So even though there was an increase in value, they weren't able to that wasn't cash in their pockets. So a lot of planters didn't fill these out because they didn't actually help them to make more money from day to day. But that brings me to the next segment of the talk, and the part that I want to spend most of my time on for today, which is how did planters value the people that they owned? Were they thinking about them as labor? Or were they thinking about them as capital assets? And the answer is that they're always thinking about them as both, and they're triangulating constantly between the two. So the first example I want to share with you is inventories of enslaved people on the plantation, and the way that planters use these inventories to calculate appreciation or depreciation. So here's an example. This is Form I from the same account book that I showed you before. And this particular one is from Canebrake Plantation in 1857. And if I can zoom in, I can show you how the record works. So again, we have the name of each person on the plantation listed down the left. We have their age, we have the value at the beginning of the year, and we have the value at the end of the year. Then you add up the value at the beginning of the year, you add up the value at the end of the year, and you take the difference between the two. If the value at the end of the year is greater, then the slaves have appreciated over the course of the year. And if you added up and the value has declined, then you have to depreciate your value. In either case, this should be entered into your balance sheet as an increase in the value of your assets or as a decline in the value of your assets. So what did this actually mean in practice? Well, planters are triangulating between a lot of different information. In some cases, you have people who are growing up and therefore increasing in value. In some cases, you have that the price of enslaved people has risen across the country, so everyone's value has gone up. In some places, we have planters who literally more mobilize formula. So this is an interesting example of this. At the top of the page, you see the way that this planter saw children on the plantation. And it reads, children under 1 year old, $25. Here you can see an example, George, age 0, valued at $25. And then you have children over 1 year old, $75. Kate, 1 year old, $75. Then for each additional year up to 10, it's $25 of increase per year. So what does this reflect? Well, a new baby is valued at $25. And if they make it to a year old, if they survive that first year of life, then there's a good chance that they're going to continue to make it. So you have a big jump between 25 and 75. And then each year up to 10, you have a steady increase. So in the language of accounting, this would be like straight line appreciation. But then you get to 10 and you see a wide divergence in values. If someone is large and strong and healthy, their value might continue to go up and up and up, reaching up to $800 or $1,000 in this time period, and occasionally even higher. If they're trained to work as a blacksmith or in a skilled profession, the value could be much higher than that. There are enslaved people who work as bookbinders and in very skilled trades, and their value can go higher and higher. So we have planters basically combining what we would call today mark-to-market accounting, where they say that something is the value that it is in the market, with a kind of straight line accounting depreciation, where they're adjusting things the same amount each year. And Thomas Affleck, the author of the book, writes extensively in his instructions about how important it is for planters to take all of these things into consideration, because they won't be able to evaluate the long-term profitability of their enterprise unless they consider the increase or decrease in value of the enslaved people on the plantation. And he also argues that overseers need to be held accountable for the health or the suffering of the plantation. Now, just to give you a sense of how sophisticated this is, here's a periodization chart that periodizes depreciation. Sorry, I'm going to get rid of that. I have this wacky way of slurring my slides so I can point to things, but I probably should figure out a better way since Zoom is here forever. So here is a chart that I built out of something called the Accountant's Index. The Accountant's Index is a bibliography of every publication on accounting up to 1921. Now, anytime you create a bibliography, you miss things. So this is not 100% complete. But basically, some accounting historians in the early 1920s decide they're going to compile a massive bibliography. And this is it's thousands and thousands of entries total. And this is the mentions of depreciation. So you can see we've got one in 1800, there were none earlier. There are a couple in 1815 and 1820. And then the late 1840s is when this book by Thomas Affleck makes this a recommendation that planters charge depreciation to the account book. So they're doing it well ahead of the takeoff that's going to come in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, which is going to happen in large factories and railroads across the country. And that's really where we tell the conventional story of depreciation. People argue that depreciation, but maybe some of you are interested in depreciation, so this is an exciting topic. But you know, it's just important to dramatize it for business historians. Depreciation is about being able to think about how the value of your big investment changes over time. And so if you think that making big investments in factories and buildings and land is important to the development of big business, then figuring out how to think about depreciation of your railroad cars and tracks is essential before you can have that growth. So what we see here is that planters are doing this on a large scale well before the railroads. Here's another example of an inventory. This one isn't as well suited to calculating appreciation and depreciation, but it does show the occupation of enslaved people. And you can see here the huge range in different values. It's a year later than the previous one, and the price of slaves, even though the Civil War is upon us, has increased. And so you see that the most valuable slaves being valued at $1,500. Looking back to this other record, one thing to note also, though, is people often ask me about depreciation. In these records, you see people valued at 0. Here's Mina, 77, Sue D, 56, valued at 0. And when you look at these records, you often see people valued at 0. When you look at records from slave traders, from the sale of people, you also see people who have a negative value. Because the cost of someone who can't do work, you have to feed them and care for them. And so when slave traders put values on people, you occasionally see them attaching a negative value. And the way they would do that is they would bundle people for sale together into larger groups, so that someone of a high value is bundled with maybe a grandparent of a low value. So there's someone of worth $1,000, someone else is worth -100, and they're sold together. And planters used to talk about how humane they were by selling people in these family groups. But when you think about the way they're doing valuation, you can see that they're also getting a pecuniary upside from bundling people together. So this is another example of an inventory. But I've been talking a little bit about railroads. And so I wanted to share one from a Southern railroad. This is the 1857 annual report of the South Carolina Railroad Company. You have a list of all of the enslaved people owned by the railroad, the date of purchase, from whom they're purchased, and the cost. The railroad doesn't seem to do an extensive valuation and revaluation from year to year. And this is most likely because compared to the cost of the other assets that the railroad owns, this is a relatively small portion. So you can see here is the adding up of everything at the end of the year. By far the biggest costs are cars and locomotives right here in the middle. But what's interesting also is that railroads are pointed to as the setting for innovation in some of these techniques. And if you page a few pages forward from this record of valuing enslaved people, you see a record for locomotives. And even though the categories are a little bit different, the format is nearly the same. So they're functionally evaluating people through the same lens and using the same tools that they use to evaluate locomotives and cars and trucks. This is one case where you have a corporation that's owning plantations. But many of these inventories are used in a way that doesn't, just a second. Sorry. So many of these actually meant that people didn't have to incorporate. So because you could use these kinds of inventories to get a mortgage or to get a loan, and so they created access to all kinds of other abilities to raise money. So that's the first category. The next one that I want to talk about is grading practices and priceless. And I've already spoken a tiny bit about how the records of auctioneers and slave traders look different. And that's partly because, you know, on a slave plantation, this practice of valuation is so that the planter can look at his business and understand how he's doing. And rarely does anyone actually going to pay those prices. But slave traders and people who are putting people up for sale are really in the market. And so they're having to think about price in a different way. So here's a really striking example of the extent to which planters were able to reduce enslaved people into categories to think about selling them. So for a bit of context, this time period is also a period for the rise of futures markets in cotton and sugar. And scholars who write in the history of futures markets write about how essential it is that that cotton and wheat and sugar are graded into categories, because if they're graded into standard categories, then those markets can function liquidly. Someone can buy a bushel of cotton without inspecting it individually. They can buy a bushel of a certain grade, and they can even buy it in the form of a futures contract. And what this record shows is that planters, even though there are no futures markets for slaves, at least not yet, on the eve of the US Civil War, planters are using the same kind of categories that people used to grade wheat and corn and sugar to grade people. So let's zoom in and see what it looks like. At the top, you have extra men, which would be prime field hands. These are basically people who are kind of, you know, 20 to 35, healthy, strong, able to do the most work that you could expect a person to do. They wouldn't include things like smiths, highly skilled people, but they do include kind of every other kind of enslaved person who is at the peak of their capacity. Then there's number one and second rate or ordinary. So these are like grading categories, like first grade and second grade. Then they have extra girls, which are going to be these prime women, rated slightly lower. Then number one, then second rate or ordinary. Then at the bottom, they have the rating for children. Boys 7 feet high, boys 4 feet 3 inches, boys 4 feet 6 inches, all the way up to 5 feet high. At which point the categories and the prices meet the adult prices. Girls of the same height match boys of the same prices. So why would they be pricing people by height, right? This seems like a not particularly useful way to think. Why not price people by age? And I think that that difference is can tell you a lot about the power dynamics in the market. Height is really useful for a trader and a purchaser because they can verify height without the consent of the enslaved person on the plantation. The person that is being sold can't contest their height. It can be measured by the seller, it can be measured by the buyer, and so they can agree on a contract and a price. By contrast, something like age, enslaved people can and did attempt to influence the course of the sale. They attempt to prevent a sale or to encourage a sale, depending on their perception of a master. And there's great research on how enslaved people worked so hard to try to shape sales because, you know, to be sold with loved ones and to be sold to a master who they thought would be kinder rather than more difficult. At the bottom here, you also see a notation, good young woman and first child. And you can see her value is higher. This is in part because the child is coming with the woman, but it's also because a good young woman who has a first child, so this is a woman who has not only is fertile, but has also survived childbirth, is likely to have value reproductively also. So you can see here planters are investing in people for their production capacity, for their ability to pick and work, but they're also investing in the reproduction capacity of women. And these records, of course, are just bands of price. So people would be priced individually, but they are remarkably uniform considering the vast diversity among the people who are actually being collapsed into these categories. One thing that's really interesting about thinking about the moment of sale is thinking about what happens when an enslaved person had the ability to purchase themselves. And we have, both from slave narratives and from some slave markets, records of enslaved people who have been able to raise enough money to buy their own freedom. And one thing that stands out is that often an enslaved person didn't have access to these same market prices. If you think about these standardized commodity prices that are valuing people as if they're similar to each other, and then you compare them to the prices that enslaved people had to pay when they purchased their own freedom, you find that in the US South, enslaved people often had to overpay. In the Spanish Empire, slaves had a right of coartación, so they had a right to purchase their own freedom. It was protected by law, and they had a right to do though at a price that was kind of a market price. And they don't enjoy that freedom in the US. And so economists who've looked at values have found that people have to pay 20% more for their freedom when they're the person in the negotiation. And if you look at slave narratives, you find examples of people talking about how they had to overpay or pay extremely high prices for their freedom. And why would this be? Well, a planter who's looking at this list of prices, who's trying to find someone to pick on a cotton plantation, doesn't really care who he gets, right? But an individual trying to purchase their freedom can't have just anyone. They need to have their own freedom. A mother who's trying to purchase their child's freedom can't purchase any boy of 4 feet high. They have to purchase their own child. And so the owner of the person or the owner of the child has what you basically monopoly power. They own the only one and singular good. So they're able to extort people for extra payment. There's an example from the Caribbean where a woman named Pamela Monroe in Trinidad wanted to purchase her freedom, and her owner refused to sell her at any price, claiming that she was priceless to him. And of course, what he meant by priceless was not really priceless. It was a very, very high price that's nowhere in line with this market price. This is another an example of a sale advertisement. And here you can see after the sale, the prices have been written in next to each person to show what they actually sold for. And here's one final example. This is an example of what I referred to earlier, the example of negative pricing. So when you look into a slave trader's records, you can see these are lots of people grouped into lots. Lot number 44 is Philip, negative $50, Betsy, 800, Billy, 1,100, an infant, $100, and then old Betty, valued at negative 50, and they add up the whole range to come to a total value. So they're selling people together, but it's a financial upside for the planter. And it's a reflection of their awareness of kind of, what you call net present value, that in accounting terms, this person is worth less to them than zero. So the final genre of records that I want to share with you is what I've called fractional hands. This isn't one where planters had a name for it. But this is if you think about the previous records as how do they put prices on people to make them available for sale. This next set of records is about how do you rate people so you can compare them to each other, and so that how you can compare them to other people's slaves, and so that you can add up their value to make comparisons. So here's what I mean. This is another kind of inventory from the 1840s. It's a little bit hard to read. This is from some battered microfilm, but you have the names of the full hands. So people that the planter is considering able to pick a full task, to do a full day's work. Then you have over here, hands that are not full. AFA rated as 3/4 of a person. Cripple Susie rated at 0. And it goes down half, 0, 0. Then at the bottom there are children who are rated smaller as well. So why go through this rating? So one reason is to think about how much you expect people to pick. But a big reason was so that planters could make comparisons across plantations, because every plantation was, you had not just a different workforce, but a different community living on it. And this allowed people to compare a community that was mostly children to a community that was mostly older, and to think about whether their output was comparable. So to give just a few examples, and these are from Frederick Law Olmsted, who was a traveler who traveled around the South and wrote about what he saw. So he writes, on one plantation, there were 135 slaves, big and little, of which 67 went to the field regularly, equal, the overseer thought, to fully 60 private hands. So this is a language where you can take 135 enslaved people, rate them as fractions of a hand, sort of like a fraction of an FTE, add those all up and decide that they're equivalent to having 60 prime hands. A contributor to the Southern Cultivator wrote in with a comparison of profits. And he wrote that he owned 13 hands, mostly boys and women. For the purpose of analysis, these could be counted at 10 good hands. Then he calculated the value of these hands and added it to his other capital costs and charged the whole thing at 8% interest. On a rice plantation in North Carolina, the whole number was 200, reckoned to be equal to about 100 prime hands. By the overseer's assessment, this was an unusual strength for the number of all classes. But another planter said that he had a proportion somewhat smaller than usual, but he explained that it was not due to infirmity or weakness. Rather, he bragged that his women were uncommonly good breeders, and he had never heard of babies coming so fast as they did on the plantation. So once again, we see someone invested in production day to day. How much can people pick, but also how many children can we expect to add to my bottom line going forward. And here's another example, and I should say here that this one is very unusual. Most people who use this fractional hand system rate people in quarters of a hand, but this is someone who wrote in rating people as a tenth of a hand. So he has 8 men who rate full hands 8, a man 1 hand off who rates half, a boy of 16 years old is rated at 0.7, and then he adds everything up to get a total of 20 hands, even though there are many, many more people working on this plantation. So planters are valuing people in at least these 3 different ways. They're thinking about, and from one perspective, like, of course, there are many ways to value people. People are so complicated and individual, and to think about them as an asset requires some kind of sophisticated data analysis. But you can also see them moving between these different ways of valuing them in order to figure out how to run their plantations effectively. This is a hypothetical project of growing cotton on a large scale where someone is doing the calculations to see what they think they need to set up a new plantation. They need a certain amount of land at the top. They need 50 prime field hands. That's that prime category of full hand or a number 1 extra. They need 50 half hands. They need 50 quarter hands. And then they go down. And what you see is they use these numbers of full, half, and quarter hands to figure out their annual production. They say at 4 bales per hand, and so they're having 50 prime hands plus 25 prime hands made of half hands, and then a quarter that of quarter hands, and then they do their multiplication to figure out this total number of pounds. And if you do the math, you can see that it works out, and that's how they're using the fractions. And they figure out this is how much cotton they're going to pick. Then they have increase of slaves, the expected reproduction and the increase of the number of their slaves. They value that, and they figure out their total expected production. They deduct their expenses, and then they figure out their profits. Here's one other example. This one is from the Caribbean, from Friendship Plantation Journal. On the left-hand side, we have an inventory, but of a fairly unique form. We have all the occupations down the left-hand side, and then across the top, we have men, women, boys, girls, and children. The children are, I think, under 12. And so you have them classifying every person on the plantation by their skills, and then also by demographics. So in a sense, this is if you think about this in the language of modern business, this is like a dashboard of all the people working on the plantation. It makes immediately visible what skills they have on the plantation, but also what the demographics of the plantation are. And then on the right-hand side, you have any increase or decrease, which is this cruel accounting shorthand for birth and death. It's filled in. This is part of a larger form that gets folded up into a neat little form and shipped back across the Atlantic to someone in London who's able to consult the records and see if he thinks the plantation is being well managed without even having to read the names of the people on the plantation. So stepping back from these records, why is it worth taking the time to wade back through these really, really difficult records? So from a historian's perspective, let me give you a couple reasons, and then let me step back a little bit further to talk about what I think we can learn from the records more generally. So the fourth thing is to think about what enslaved people were up against. This is not just a system where they're up against violence. It's a system, it's an economy where information and data blended together with violence to maintain control over people. So when you hear or think about enslaved resistance or rebellion, you have to think about them pushing not just back against violence and ownership, but a very modern version of that, where they're being managed and controlled both by data and by the threat of being hurt. And I think that observation can help us to reconcile two different ways that people have taught 19th century US historiography. And I know you're not historians, but I'll just give you a tiny taste of this. And one thing that historians have spent a lot of time doing in the last 25 years is to uncover the ways enslaved people were able to exert agency over the spaces that they're in and develop vibrant cultures despite the constraints of plantation life. And people have dug into records, some like this, and figured out ways to pull enslaved agency out of it. And on the other hand, and even as people are developing these vibrant cultures and communities, we see that slavery was getting stronger. And how can these two things happen at the same time? And I think it makes a lot of sense to see them happening together if slavery is becoming more modern, more technological, and more data-driven. It's able to blend violence with information and data in order to maintain control, which in some ways creates space and makes it less necessary to use violence, but in other ways makes the system more closed. So as we approach the Civil War, we have a setting where enslaved agency is on the rise, but also control is on the rise. But this is a kind of set of questions that are more historical, like how do we explain like the coming of the Civil War? What about like what we just do with these records? Why is it worth wading back through these really horrifying records? And I think that they offer a cautionary tale for modern businesses, especially when you're thinking of data. And I think the emotional experience you have when you encounter them can go one of two ways. I think for people who haven't looked at a lot of these records, and sometimes for me in the archives, I'm reading through and you see a baby who's valued at $25. You see the kind of human jump out of the archive. And so the violence is there and it's easy to see. But on the other hand, there's not a lot of the human that's there. There's a lot of data. And planters could march through these records and they could forget, they could add and they could calculate and they could ignore the human in the data as well. They're not so different than an Excel spreadsheet where you have data about a wide range of people, but you don't have to think about the things behind that data. They give you an amount of distance, which may be not from a slave plantation, maybe from outsourced labor somewhere else. And what does that data tell you? It tells you certain things about productivity and profitability, and it tells you much, much less about human costs. So if we want to think about how to develop more ethical data systems, then looking at data systems that were highly profitable and also deeply unethical is really, really valuable. Too often when we talk about like business innovation, there's sort of an assumption that innovation and profitability and capitalism are always helping us to move further away from violence. And this is a setting where violence and innovation were, to borrow a kind of business word, synergistic, and one could enable more of the other. And if you're thinking about kind of what kinds of choices that businesses make, then it's really valuable to be aware that you're not always going to be able to find the choice that's both profitable and ethical. The, we have like rhetoric around social responsibility, kind of has this idea in it that if we just think hard enough, we'll be able to find a set of choices that are more ethical, and those are also going to make us more profitable. And this is a setting where people took a set of choices that made them more profitable that are clearly unethical. And it doesn't mean we stop looking for those choices that are both profitable and ethical, but it means you have to acknowledge that sometimes those two things are not going to go together, and there's nothing inevitable about them going together. So I'll end with this image. And for those of you who have got a chance to read the introduction to my, to the reading, this is one that appears there. And I like this image because I think it conveys something of the same distance. If you read that introduction, you know that I used to be a management consultant before I was a historian. And I was like the most junior person on the team running the spreadsheet. And running those spreadsheets, I was often calculating data, which was in certain ways vast distances from the data I've shown you today. I wasn't calculating about whether to sell a person. But it was data that had big effects on people's lives, and I didn't have to think about whether people were people. From the comfort of my computer, a Zoom away today, I suppose, and a spreadsheet away then, there was a really comfortable distance that allowed me to make a set of decisions that, if you thought about them a lot harder, could make you uncomfortable. And this is a similar scene from a planter's desk. What did it look like to be sitting at a planter's desk? You're not the overseer on the plantation. Maybe you're even across an ocean working in London to manage a plantation in the Caribbean. And you have this pastoral scene even as you're calculating people's lives and the profits that they're providing for you. And I think in our moment of big data, which is going to continue, there's even more of a black box around a lot of the information that we're dealing with. And so it's even harder to think. They had to think across an ocean, but we have to think through layers and layers of data. And it's worth trying to do so if we're going to make data such an important part of our decision making. All right. So thank you so much. That's all I've got. And I'm really excited to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Rosenthal. That was really interesting. Would you like me to keep the queue and then you can answer different questions or comments?
That sounds great.
Okay, I'll stop the recording now so people can ask questions. It'll be recorded.